And welcome to my YouTube channel, Nerdy the Coder. Today we're going to be talking about a new topic that's called objects, and we're going to be tackling the basics of objects, and it's going to be an introductory lecture on objects. But before diving into the lecture, please make sure that you watch the previous lectures on JavaScript in order to follow along that tutorial. So yeah, let's just dive into the lecture. As we know from the chapter data types, and there are 8 data types in JavaScript. 7 of them are called primitive data types because their values contain only a single thing. So for example, we have a variable that is of type string, then it can only have the value of string type. It cannot have a boolean type value or a number type value. Objects are used to store keyed collections of various data and more complex entities. So unlike the primitive data types, objects are more complex, and its data is basically consists of all of those data types that we already learned. So it can have data like a string, can have booleans, can have numbers, and all that. And JavaScript objects penetrate almost every aspect of the language, and it's important to understand them first before going anywhere else. So basically, JavaScript is more relying on the objects, and you will be using it normally everywhere in JavaScript. So it's basically a core thing to learn in JavaScript. So before diving into anywhere deeper into the language, it's just important to learn about objects and how it really works and how to deal with objects. Objects can be created with the curly braces. We can see it here. What are the curly braces with list of properties? So as we have seen how we declare functions. So basically we have the body, or even you have seen that in the loops as well. We have the body of the loop or body of a function. We enclose the body of the function with the curly braces. So same thing here, but just as a data type, we are enclosing the properties within the list of within the pair of the braces. A property is basically a key value pair, where key is usually a string and value can be anything. So within these braces, we define list of properties, and then the key is basically a string. It should be a string, and the value could be anything. It could be a number. It could be a string itself, or it could be another object, a nested object that we'll just learn in the next lectures. So yeah, let's just define our first object and see how it looks. So yeah, let's just I just opened my VS Code. There's the old code, and I'll just get rid of this. And for example, we have the way we used to define declare the primitive data types. We used to write the let keyword, or we can make use of constant as well if it's a constant variable, but for now we just use let. And for example, I wanted to define a name variable, and I can assign it to a single value, for example Jackson Dante. So it can only have like one value. Now what happens if we define, for example, I want to store the name, age, and different properties of a user in one variable? How we can do that? So basically that's where the concept of objects comes in. So for example, we have another variable that's called user, and I want to store different values of the user. For example, want to store the name, age, and all those. So I can do this. So with the help of objects. So first I have to declare the object. I can make use of the curly braces object. This is how I declare an object in JavaScript, and then I can define different properties of the user. For example, first name. Okay, and this is basically the key, and it is basically a string, and then we have to define a value, but the key and value should be separated by a colon. So just make sure that you put a colon after the key, and if you want to assign a value to this property key. For example, the first name is basically Jackson, and then if I want to add another value, another property to this same object, then I have to put a comma, and then I can put another value, another key that's, for example, we call it last name, and then I'll have to put a colon, and then I can assign it a value that could be anything, but for now I'm just putting Dante. If I want to create a new property again, then I have to put a comma, and then I can put another key that I'm calling it age, and I'll have to put a colon, and then I can assign it a value. So here now you can see that we have defined this user object. We have two properties over here that are of type string because of the value we can see, but we have another property that's of that is age. So age is basically, we define it as a number. So for example, I put 25 over here. So here you can see that we are defining the user object. It has like different data types of properties. So we can define the first name and last name as strings, but age is a number, so it supports them. So yeah, this is how we define basically the data types. The object data type. We can imagine an object as a cabinet with files. Every piece of data is stored in its file by the key. It's easy to find a file by its name, or add or remove file. So basically what we have seen here, for example, if you take an object and you can just guess an example of a cabinet where we have different files. So each files have its own key value, key name, and it has a certain type of data. So it could be anything. The data inside the file could be anything, but the label on top of that is basically a string. So that's how we know that this is the file name and this is the data of the file. So you can just take an example of a cabinet which has multiple files, and we are naming the files, and then can find the data in that file based on that key name. So this is how you can relate it to a cabinet. An empty object can be created using one of the two syntaxes. So we have two syntaxes basically. The way we create an object, we have two syntaxes. So the first one is basically this. So we create a variable, we assign it a new object constructor. We call it object constructor. So here we use a new keyword, and then declare an object over here. We'll learn about that the constructors in the upcoming lectures, what is an object constructor and how we can define it basically. But yeah, for now, just keep in mind how we declare the object variables. And there's another method that we just used that is called object literal. So if you want to define your object, you can use one of these two syntaxes, and you will be declaring your first object. Literal in properties. We can put some properties into the curly braces as key value pairs, as we just saw. The property key is also known as name or identifier. So basically over here, if you go to the code, you can see that we also call it a name. We call this property a name, or key, or identifier. The property key is known as name or identifier. Yeah, we can do the following operations on an object. So now we'll talk about different objects operations, what we can do with an object, how we can manipulate an object. But yeah, first let's declare another object with a new keyword first and see if it works out. So for example, we have this object, we have declared it with the object literal this, and for example we have another object that we want to declare, for example, that is called a car, and we can declare it with the new keyword and then object with the followed by the parenthesis. And this is how we can declare another object. And if we want to add properties to add, then we can make use of the dot operator. And for example, if I want to add a property to this, then I can say, for example, car dot model equal to 2022 and something like that. This way we can add properties to this car object. And the same way with the object literal, we can just assign it like this, and we can also make use of this. But for now, just keep in mind that how we declare the variables. So let's just talk about the different object operations, what we can do with and how we can manipulate an object. So accessing properties, values, and objects. For example, we have an object. Let's just commit this out for now, and let's just talk about the simple object literal type of the object. So for example, we have an object called user. We have different properties, how we can access the properties. For example, if I want to access the first name or last name or age of this user object, how we can do this. So we can simply make use of a dot operator. We will just print the value of for example, the first name, so that we can take the user. Okay, a user is basically the object itself, and if we want to access any of the property of the user object, we can make use of dot operator, and you can see the list of the properties that we can access: the age, the first name, and the last name. For example, I want to access the first name. I can just save the file, and I'll open the browser. I'll refresh. You can see I have access to the first property of the user object. For example, I want to access the last name as well, then I can do the same thing. For the last name, I can type in the object name, then dot operator, and then the last name, and I'll save it, refresh. You can see Jackson Dante. Also, if I want to print out the age of the user object, I can make use of, for example, user, and then use the dot operator, and then age, and I'll refresh. You can see Jackson Dante 25. This is how we can access different values in the object. Adding a property to the object. How we can add a property to an object. For example, I have this object and I want to add a new property to this object, and I want to access it later. For example, to add a new property called, let's say, height, then we can just make use of the same dot operator, and we can define our property over here. So even we cannot see it here, we are not actually accessing it. Basically, the syntax of accessing the property in an object and the syntax of creating a new property within the user object or any object is the same basically. But in this case, we have to assign it a value. It could be any type of value. It could be a boolean, it could be a number, it could be a string, or any other data type. But yeah, in this case, we are not accessing it, so we have to assign a value to it. For example, I say that the height is 190 centimeter, and it's basically a string because we're defining different data types. So the height is this now. So can we access this property over here? Yes, we can now. So for example, if I want to access the height of the user now, you can not see it in here on the list because we are adding it dynamically, but you can still access it. And if I save the file and refresh it, you can see this object, the user object, has now the property over here, the property height over here. What happens if I want to print the whole object and I don't want to, just list or access only one property of the object? I can just save the file and I can just do this as well. I can just print the whole object as it is. When I refresh, you can see this kind of thing over here in the console. So when I click this small arrow button over here, you can see the age, you can see the first name, and the height, and the last name. So you can see that we have 3 defined properties, and after the declaration, we are assigning a new value, a new property called height to the user object, and this gets added to the object, and now we can just print the value of height, and this will be available to us. So this is how we can add different properties to the object. Also, in this case, using the construct object, we can also do the same thing over here. We can, for example, car.model in order to add an object to the to add a property to the object, to the car object over here. We can still do the same, and we can console log, for example, the car object in total, and we can refresh and see. You can see over here model 2022 is added to the car object. And we can also define, for example, car type or make. We can say, okay, so for example, I assign it to BMW and save it and refresh. You can see that now we have two properties because we are assigning 2 properties to the car object. And you can see over here the make and the model. And if I want to access for example, the model of the object, I can just put it like this: dot operator, make use of dot operator, and then the model, the property name, what is this key, the model, and I can refresh and you can see the model of the car object. So yeah, this is basically the same thing, but I think this is more used in JavaScript by the engineers or the developers, because of the ease of use and declaration. You just don't have to do using the new keyword and the object. And within the object literal, you can just specify the property name. So assigning you don't have to assign new properties or add new properties with this syntax. So it's easier to do it this way rather than doing it this way. But sometimes you have use cases, depending on your use case, you might need to add new properties to the existing object, so you can do it like that. But if you already know the properties and you have access to the object, then you can do it like this, and you can just initialize the object literal with initial properties like that. For now, I'll just comment it out. So yeah, we just talked about accessing properties from an object and adding properties to an object. Let's see what's next. Deleting a property from an object. What happens how we can delete actually properties from an object? So let's say we have this user object over here, and we are adding a property to this one. Well, now I want to get rid of the last name. I don't need the last name over here, the last name property over here. So what we can do, so remember, we're not getting rid of the value of the key of the property, but I want to get rid of the whole property from the user object. So in this case, I can just do delete. I can make use of the delete keyword. It's basically a keyword that is reserved in JavaScript. And I can specify the property name. So it could be either first name, last name, age, or even height. So if I want to get rid of the last name, I can just specify the property name, last name. And if I print the whole object now and save it, you can see we have the first name, last name is not deleted. Sorry, it should be user.last name. And if I save it again, refresh, you can see age. You can see the first name, you can see the height, but you cannot see the last name. So this is how we can delete. So what I'm constructing, or what I'm telling the JavaScript, okay, go to this object and delete this specific property of the object. So this is how we can do that. So for example, now I want to delete, we can also delete multiple properties. I want to get rid of the first name as well. So I can save it and refresh. Only age and height are deleted. What happens if I delete, for example, I added the height property dynamically to this user object, and I want to get rid of it right after it is added, and then print the object and see if it is there. So if I go to the object, you can see age is there, first name is there, last name is there, but height is not, no more part of the user object. So this is because we are deleting the height property from the object itself. You can do the same thing over here as well. Let's just uncomment it for now. And for example, I want to delete the property from here, so I can simply do car.model, get rid of this model, and then print out the whole object. It's commented, and you can see the car object is just only have one property that is called the Mac. And because I got rid of the model, I deleted the car model from the car object. That's why I'm not seeing it anymore. So yeah, this is how it works. The syntax on the object literal or the object constructs are the same. We can also have multi-word property names. So for example, if I want to have a property over here, in order to have like I'm making use of the underscore over here just to combine the two words first and name. What if I don't want to make use of the underscore over here, and I want to use multiple words for the key? So in order to do that, I must do the quoting over here. So I have to do this in order to make it work. So yeah, this works as well in JavaScript. If you have a key name that is made of multiple words and that are separated by a space, then you have to wrap them in double quotes. So this is how it works. So now if I want to access it, basically, so I can access it with the dot operator as well. But yeah, The problem is now if I want to access it, for example, user dot, you can see that this is no more listed over here. So if I want to access it now, it won't be available. For example, I user dot first name, I do something like this, and I'll get rid of the delete as well over here. And for example, I want to do this, user dot first name, since it is defined over here. Or let's just, before doing this, let's see if it is really there. I'll just save it, and I'll get to the VS Code in the browser. You can see first name, last name, it is there. But if I want to access the first name, for example, first name, and I save it and I refresh the page, I would be seeing an error that says missing parentheses after argument list. So it is throwing an error because the dot operator has certain limitation. I cannot access a property that has a space between it, so it doesn't know. So it's basically accessing, and the JavaScript will consider it as a first property. So it doesn't know if this really exists because first property is not there. It is basically a first name. So that's why we cannot access the first name or last name because it has space. We cannot access it with the dot operator. So what we can do in this case, we can basically make use of another concept in objects that is called the square brackets, and we have to specify this property within the quotes. We can either make use of single quotes or double quotes, or we can even make use of the backticks. But yeah, for now I'll just use double quotes, and I can specify my name over here. I can say first name, and I save it, refresh. You can see the name is now printed out. So this is how it works really. The last property in the list may end with the comma. You can also specify a comma over here that's called a trailing comma over here. We can also specify that because it will just make it just consistent, and we can see that this is called the trailing comma or hanging comma. Makes it easier to add or remove or move around properties because all line becomes alike. Square brackets. We just talked about square brackets a little bit, but now we'll talk about it in more details. For multiple properties, the dot access doesn't work, as we just saw. Example is use the full name, John or something like that. It doesn't work. JavaScript does not understand that and will throw an error because it will interpret that user.full, and because this user.full does not exist, because it's a full name property, so then we have to make use of the square brackets. And there's an alternative square bracket notation that works with any string. For example, if I want to access the full name over here, we can just make use of the square brackets, and we don't have to put any dot over here. We can just make use of the square brackets and then specify the property name that is first name, that is the key, and we'll have access to the value actually. Square brackets also provide a way to obtain the property name as a result of an expression. That's correct. So for example, I want to make use of this key in multiple places or anything, so I can just even assign it another variable. For example, we have a variable that I name it key, and I assign it a value of this. Then I can even make use of this key property. For example, we have the key values are dynamic in some use cases, and you can just assign it to a variable and then specify it over here, and you will have access to the same value with that key. Let's refresh it, and you can see we are getting the same value since we are assigning it a variable, but the variable value is basically the first name, that is the correct key that is existing in the user object. Then we'll have access to this. What happens if I want to print out the last name? This will work out again. And also if I want to specify another value that's called age, for example, age, I want to print the value for this property over here, then I can just do a refresh and you can see the value for that. So this is how the square bracket works in JavaScript objects. This method of creating property names in runtime is called computed properties. So if you're using this syntax of creating the property name, the property keys, then this method is called computed properties, because the property names or identifiers or keys are calculated in the runtime. Square brackets are much more powerful than the dot notation, as we saw that we cannot access the word which is formed with full, like multiple words separated by spaces. Then it doesn't have access to that. Even we can use make use of variables in that. They allow any property names and variables, but are also more cumbersome to write. So most of the time, when property names are known and simple, the dot is used. So for example, if you want to make use of the square brackets, then they're a bit harder to write. So that's why people most of the time, if the property names are known, they make use of the dot operator. Otherwise, they just go with the square brackets. But it's just totally up to the engineer or the developer, whatever they want to use. If we need something more complex, then we switch to square brackets. Property value shorthand. We often use existing variables as values for property names. For example, we can make use of this as well. So let's say we have an object. This is it has a user has, for example, a name, and I'm talking about, for example, full name over here. Okay, and I want to assign it a value from another variable. Let's say it has the same thing, and I want to assign it a value over here. So I can do something like this, and I can assign this variable to this with that one. For example, let's say it's a constant variable, and the name of the variable is name, and the value of this variable is Jackson Dante. It's basically a username. So if I want to assign this value to a property of this object, I can do something like this. So we have this object that's called user. The name of the user is basically this name. So if I want to print the name over here, I can simply do this, user dot name, and it will print out the value. I can refresh and you can see Jackson Dante. So it works out. So, but there is a shorthand writing this because you can see this is a bit redundant, and we have the same. We're using the same key values. So the key name is the same as the value name. This is the dynamic value. We can make it anything, but the variable name used here is the same to the key of the user object. So in this case, in the above example, properties have the same name as variables. Instead of name colon name, we can just write name like this. So yeah, we can just get rid of the value and make it like this. So it literally means name colon name. So if we have a use case, or we have a case that an object we have the variable name and the property key have the same names, then we can just make use of this shorthand an object. Let's just make another example. For example, we have also an age defined over here that is 35, for example, and I want to make use of the same variable over here. Then age is, you can see then the variable name as basically age, and the property key name is also age. So then I can get rid of one and leave it like that. And if I save it and refresh, you can see Jackson Dante, and I want to, print out the age as well. You can make use of that, and you can see the age as well. So this is how we can use the shorthand property names in the JavaScript objects. Property names limitations. How we can define property names in objects. As we already know, a variable cannot have a name equal to one of the language reserved words like for, let, return, function, and all that. So whatever keywords are reserved by the language itself, we cannot name it as a variable name. For an object property, there is no such restrictions. Wow, this is really cool. For example, we have a user object, and I want to, for example, a user have a property that is called, let's say, function. Okay, but this is a reserved keyword by JavaScript, but still I can make use of it. And it won't throw any error to me. For example, I'm a function and I want to access it. Then I can simply use it a function, and it will just get me the value. I'll refresh. You can see I'm a function. So in order to use the reserved keywords and the use in any object in JavaScript, we have no restrictions for naming the property names. Other types like numbers, as they are automatically converted to strings. For example, we have a 0 and 1, 2, 3, they'll be automatically converted to this. So let's assume that the property names are, numbers. We can make use of any number over here, and we can assign it any value. For example, I'm a number key or value, whatever, and I'll just make it smaller a little bit. So what happens now? Can we access it? Yeah, we can do. If I do this and I do 1, 2, 3, okay. But here you cannot access it like that. We have to make use of square brackets over here, and we can simply do this because this number will be converted to a string automatically by JavaScript. So if I do this and refresh the page again, you can see I'm a number value. So there is literally no restriction on, naming your properties. So you can make use of string, you can make use of numbers, you can even use the keywords reserved by JavaScript itself. Property existing in the use of in operator. For example, we have different use cases that we want to check for a property. If it exists in the object, then you can make use of the in operator. A notable feature of objects in JavaScript is that it's possible to access any property. There will be no error if the property doesn't exist. It will just simply return undefined. Reading a non-existent property just returns undefined. Let's see this in action. For example, let's say we have a user object. Let's just get rid of this and make it more cleaner. And I'll see, let's just let them leave over here. Let's say I want to check or I want to print out some property in the user object. Let's say I want to print out the age. I'll just get the result directly, and I can see that. Let's say I want to print out a value, for example, that's called eye color. But you can already see that the eye color does not exist over here. I'm not adding it over here, and even it's not defined over here in the user object. What happens now? When I save it and refresh, you can see it's undefined. So it doesn't throw any error, but it returns undefined. So yeah, this is how the JavaScript objects property works. If you want to access a variable, a property in an object that is not defined in the object itself, then it will just return undefined. We can also check if a key exists in an object using the in operator. So yeah, to make more out of it, more out of the objects, we can make use of an in operator, and we can put a condition. For example, if a property name exists in this object, how we can make a check on the object itself. For example, let's say I want to check if the name exists in the user object. So how I can do that? I'll just have to put the quotes, the double quotes, and then I can specify the property key, which in this case is name. I want to check for name, and then I have to make use of the in operator, and then the object name, whatever is the object name. So in this case, we have the object name is user. So I'm checking over here if name property exists in the user object. If it is true, if this condition is true, then just print a message or do whatever is necessary. I mean, whatever is your use case. But in this example, I'll just print a message. Okay, I'll say that okay, name exists in user object. I'll just comment it out for now, and I'll just save it, and I'll just refresh. You can see name exists in the user object because this condition is true. The name exists. Now, for example, I want to check for another variable that's called, for example, eye color in user object. What happens now? I get no message because it does not exist in the user object. So this is how we can make check for different properties in an object in JavaScript. Example is key object. Why does the operator exist? Isn't it enough to compare against undefined? So yeah. There's a special case when it fails, but in works correctly. Let's say we have, why do we make use of the in operator? Isn't it just simply we can just do, instead of writing this whole crap and that, checking for individual property and object, can't we just make use of this, and it will just return undefined, and we can just check it against undefined. So if it is undefined, then just make it true, and it will not. So this is how we can check it. So isn't it enough? No, because let's say we have another property over here that is called eye color, and we assign it undefined. Let's say the value of eye color is undefined. We did not assign anything to the eye color. And what happens now? So if I do something like this, user.eyecolor, what it returns? It will return undefined. If I do this, for example, if I do this, user.color, then console log a message, eye color exists and user object. That's correct. And you can now see that the eye color exists in the user object, but would it just print a message for us? Let's see. We are getting nothing because the value of the eye color is undefined. So that's why this condition does not works out for us. So this is where the AND operator comes to the rescue. And because the property do exist, but the value of the property is undefined, still this condition is false for us. What if we do something like, instead of doing that, we can just check for the property and not for the property value. We are not checking the value of the property, but we are just checking if the property itself exists in the object. So if property eye color exists in the user object, then print this message. So you can see we now have printed the message out because the property do exist, but the value is undefined. Here we don't care about the value, but the property itself. So here the property is defined, but not the value. So if you are making use of, for example, directly, if you're saying that, okay, user.eyecolor, then it is basically referring to the value of the property eye color and not the property itself. So that's why we have to be a little bit careful about making use of this dot operator. So instead, if you're curious about knowing the property itself, it exists on the property on the user object, then just make use of the AND operator. Yeah, example is this, and you can see I already explained this to you. User.name will return false and name will return true. The for and loop. We have a special loop for objects, and for example, if I want to print out the values of an object, how we can do that? I have two ways to do that. For example, I want to access the name or age or function. I have to do console log user.age, and then I have to console log again user.eyecolor and all that. So what if I have hundreds of values and object and some more complex object? It will still work, but I'll have to write each property and access each property by the dot operator, and it's not really helpful. So for this case, we can also loop through the properties of object by using a special kind of loop that is called a for in loop. It is different than the for loop that we've used before in the previous lectures. Here the syntax is a little bit different. So what we can do, how we define a for in loop. So in the for loop, we have to define first the key. So we say let key or const key. We just make use of let key in object. So, and then there goes the body of the loop. So what happens over here? So key and object. So we are looping through the key and object. So in this case, the object is basically the user, and we can name the key anything we want. But for now, we will just make use of the key because it's more obvious that, or maybe we can just name it the name or we can make use of identifier, but I think key is more appropriate. So if I console log the key, then it will print out all of the keys of this object. So if I refresh, you can see 1, 2, 3, name, age, function, eye color. So you can see all of the keys are printed out. What if I want to print out the values of these keys? So let's say I want to also print out the keys, but I also want to print out the values of each key. What are the values assigned to these keys? So I can just make use of this user object. So user and then square brackets. Remember how we access a property and an object. So we'll just make use of that. And then the key. Basically, this key returns every separate key of this user object. Then we can just make use of that. And we are using the square brackets over here as if we have something like, for example, as a value that is a key name that is separated by word, that has multiple words and separated by space, then in this case the dot operator will fail and it will throw an error or something like that. That's why for safety purpose we're just making use of the square bracket over here and assigning the value key. And if I save it and refresh, you can see 1, 2, 3 key has the value this, and then the name key has this value, age key has this value, function key has this value, eye color has undefined value. So this is a special kind of loop that we can make us, that we can make use of, and we can loop through an object key and values. To walk over all the keys of an object, there exists a special form of the loop, that is this, and order like an object. So now let's just talk about order of properties in objects. While looping through the objects with numbers as keys are sorted out. Okay, so let's say we have an object that has values, for example, like this. For example, the keys are this, the numbers, and for example, we have another key that is, let's call it 12. I'm just giving it a random number, just clear the concept of how this will be ordered or sorted out when we are looping through the object. And I have another key, for example 18, and this is this value, and then I have another key that's just called 1. So remember, we in this lecture we talked about that every number that is used as a key in this user object, it will be converted to string later on. So now we can just do the same loop, but it will not be printed in this order because numbers and an object will be sorted. So it will be sorted in ascending order. So it will just be printed like 1 and then 12 and then 18 and then 49 and then 123. So let's see if this really works out. So if I refresh, you can see 1, 12, 18, 49, and 123. So if we have used numbers as keys in an object, then the numbers will be sorted in an ascending order. But if we have used keys, string as keys as we had before, then it will just print out the values or the properties and the order that we have defined. And so that is just a small difference between making use of numbers as keys or strings as keys in a user in an object. The other appears in order they are created. And so yeah, this is a small difference between this. So again, to define it again, objects with numbers as keys are sorted in ascending order, and the others appears in order they are created in. So if we have made use of the string keys or Boolean keys, then it will appear in the order they are defined in. So yeah, this is the end of the lecture, and I hope you have learned something new from this. It is a bit, I think, complex because we've been talking about the other primitive data types, and those are simple. For example, they have just simple single values like booleans and strings and numbers. But I know objects are a little bit tedious to learn, but it's more obvious, and it will be you'll be using it a lot in the upcoming lectures as well. You'll see how we make use of objects in JavaScript. So I hope you have learned something new. Please make sure that you like and subscribe the channel and share the videos with a friend. And yeah, until then, I'll see you in the next lecture.